The last time I saw my son's face before everything changed. His eyes didn't even meet mine. He just kept looking at the screen of his phone, scrolling as if the dinner table wasn't crowded with people he called family, as if I was just another piece of old furniture in his house in Cleveland. When he finally looked up, his words didn't sound like my son at all. They sounded like a lawyer reading a contract, cold and sharp, calculated. "Dad, the mortgage is due next week. You're retired now. Your pension is the rent." There was no space for kindness in his voice. No trace of the boy I'd once cradled after nightmares, or the teenager I'd cheered for through cold autumn rain at Friday night football, or the man I'd walked down the aisle only a decade before. Just numbers, bills, and a calculation. When his fist hit the table, the sound was so sharp it snapped the room in half. My granddaughter, little Ellie, flinched so hard her glass of milk tipped and crashed, splattering white arcs across the table, soaking the grocery store placemats. Her twin brother, Tommy, looked up, eyes wide and silent, a chicken nugget suspended between his fingers and the plate, not daring to move. My daughter-in-law, Maria, started to reach for a napkin, her hands trembling, but she stopped halfway and looked at me, her lips pressed so tight they'd gone white. I had never felt so invisible. My body was right there, slouched in the old chair I'd paid for 23 years ago, but my soul was hovering somewhere near the ceiling, looking down at the scene like it was someone else's family, someone else's heartbreak. The smell of Maria's pot roast still hung in the air, heavy and familiar, but it was wasted on this table. No one was eating, no one was talking. My son, Greg, kept his arms folded across his chest, chin jutting out, staring me down as if I'd somehow become the enemy in my own bloodline. "Dad, listen," he started, voice all business now. "You're living here, you pay. That's how the world works." I could see Maria's hand twitch under the table, wanting to reach for mine, to give me some sign of loyalty, but her loyalty had limits. Like everyone's does, I guess, when the bills pile up. I turned to Ellie, whose eyes had started to fill with tears, and to Tommy, who was shrinking smaller and smaller in his seat, just wanting this all to end. I tried to find my own voice, but it sounded as thin and old as the wind rattling the icy window behind me. 40 years at Republic Steel, up before dawn, welding and grinding, hands cracked and raw, back aching, never missed a shift, never left a debt unpaid. I built the foundation of this home, paid every bill, replaced the roof myself during the blizzard of '93. All of it, for him, for Greg, so he'd have a childhood I never had. And now, all that I'd built had shrunk down to this moment. A stranger across the table from me, asking for rent in the house where he took his first steps. I didn't shout. I didn't beg. There was no point. He'd already made up his mind, and maybe I'd known deep down for months that the man across from me wasn't the boy I'd raised. Not anymore. The betrayal hit me in slow motion. My chest burned, not with anger, but with something closer to grief. I felt myself growing small inside, like a candle flickering in a draft, seconds from going out. Greg reached into his pocket and pulled out my checkbook, the same one I'd left on the kitchen counter next to the day-old coupons. "Here," he said, pushing it across the table. "Social Security hits on Thursday. You'll sign the check to me, and you'll get what's left." I opened the book. There, in his handwriting, was a number. $17. That was my share after rent. $17 for a lifetime of sacrifice. My hands shook, not from age but from rage, from shame, from the humiliation of being reduced to a bill, an invoice, an unwanted guest in the very house I'd built from nothing. I stood, pushing back my chair, and the legs scraped across the old linoleum. My mind was full of static. I could see Greg watching me like he thought I'd fight back, like he wanted me to. But I just looked at Ellie and Tommy, at Maria's pale face, and realized nothing I could say would matter. They'd already chosen their sides, or maybe they were just too tired, too afraid to speak up. I left the table, feeling 100 years old, bones aching in places I'd never noticed before. The house, once so full of laughter and warmth, seemed colder than the wind outside, colder than Cleveland's February ice storm. I grabbed my coat from the peg in the hall, the old brown one, the lining threadbare, but still warm. I stepped out onto the porch, letting the door close behind me with a quiet click. For a moment, I stood there, looking up at the gray sky, listening to the distant traffic on Euclid Avenue, breathing in the cold air until my lungs hurt. My feet took me down the block, past houses that looked just like mine. Lights in the windows, families inside, dinner smells drifting into the street. I wondered if they, too, were sitting at tables split in two by words no one could take back. At the end of the block, the city bus rumbled past, its lights glowing against the snow, and I felt a sudden, fierce urge to just get on and ride it anywhere. But I didn't. I just stood there, letting the cold seep into my bones, feeling the weight of the world on my shoulders, the weight of 40 years of labor that had somehow added up to $17 and a spot at the end of my own dinner table. I thought about my wife, Janet, how she would have handled this. She'd been gone 7 years, taken too early by the same cancer that had claimed her mother. She'd never let things get this far, I told myself. Or maybe she would have. Maybe this is what happens when the strong ones leave, and the rest of us are left to pick up the pieces, trying to hold on to dignity with hands that don't stop shaking. I stayed out there, coat pulled tight, breath puffing white clouds in the air, until the street lights flickered on and the city grew quiet. When I finally walked back inside, Greg was nowhere to be seen, his chair pushed in, his phone charging on the kitchen counter. The twins had gone upstairs, Maria's quiet voice drifting down the hallway, trying to calm them. I sat in the living room, staring at the old family photos on the mantel, all of us younger, smiling, before the world got so complicated. For a second, I almost laughed at the absurdity. How could everything change so fast? How does a father become a burden to his own son, a tenant in the house he built, a line item in the monthly bills? In that silence, I felt something inside me shift. Not a collapse, but a spark, small but stubborn. I wasn't done yet. Maybe I couldn't change Greg's heart, but I didn't have to be his victim. That night, I sat at the kitchen table long after everyone had gone to bed, my hands folded around a cup of coffee that had gone cold, my mind racing with plans I'd never dared consider before. The world outside was frozen, but somewhere deep inside me, the ice had started to crack. I didn't know what would happen next, but I knew I wasn't going to wait for Greg's permission to live my life. There was something brewing in the dark corners of that old house, something that felt a lot like hope, or maybe vengeance, or maybe just the stubborn will to survive. In that moment, $17 was all I had, but for the first time in a long while, it felt like enough to start over. As the clock in the hallway ticked past midnight, I found myself watching the shadows on the wall, imagining the look on Greg's face when he realized I was no longer his silent victim. There was still a long road ahead, and maybe more heartbreak, but I was ready to walk it. Not for revenge, not even for justice, but for the last scrap of self-respect I had left. I went to bed that night with a plan starting to form in my mind, the beginnings of a rebellion so quiet that no one in that house, not even me, could see it coming. In the darkness, the future stretched out, mysterious and uncertain, but suddenly, for the first time in years, I wanted to see what would happen next. Most nights after that first blowout at dinner, I found myself staring at the ceiling in the narrow guest room, listening to the house settle around me, counting every breath, every heartbeat, as if something was ticking down. Maria's soft voice drifted from down the hall sometimes, murmuring comfort to Ellie when the nightmares came, or shushing Tommy when he started crying in his sleep. I'd never seen the twins so quiet, so watchful, the light in their eyes shrinking every day. Even the house seemed different now, like it was holding its breath, waiting for something to snap. Some mornings I would wake to find Greg already gone for work, the scent of his cologne lingering in the hallway, a half-finished mug of coffee abandoned on the counter. He'd taken to leaving early, sometimes before dawn, as if the simple act of being in the same room with me was too much to bear. Other days, he lingered just long enough to collect the mail or to remind me, pointedly, that the bills were due. I'd nod, my mouth dry, feeling older than I ever had before. Even the way I moved changed, like I was trespassing in my own home, careful not to leave dishes in the sink or shoes in the hallway, invisible and silent. What hurt the most wasn't the money, or even the humiliation. It was the feeling that I'd somehow lost the right to belong, that my presence was nothing but a burden, a reminder of debts no one wanted to repay. Late at night, I'd look through the old photo albums I kept hidden in the back of my closet, turning pages as quietly as I could, reliving the fragments of a life that felt impossibly far away. There was Janet, standing in front of the house on the day we signed the papers, her hair pulled back with a red scarf, eyes crinkling in the sun. There was Greg as a boy, missing front teeth and grinning in a Cleveland Indians t-shirt, hoisted on my shoulders at the 4th of July parade. In those photos, you'd think we were the luckiest family on the block. No one tells you how fast it can change. Sometimes I'd find myself running my finger along the edge of a picture, wondering how we'd ended up here, and how much of the blame I'd have to carry with me. The memories didn't bring comfort. They made the distance between us feel even larger. I remembered the nights working double shifts at the steel plant, fingers so stiff I could barely turn the key in the front door, but always making it home in time to kiss Greg goodnight. Janet would wait up, sometimes just to rub my shoulders, always whispering that it would be worth it one day. We never went on big vacations, never splurged on fancy cars, but there was always food on the table and a roof over our heads. I taught Greg how to ride a bike on the cracked pavement out front, bandaged his knees when he crashed, cheered him on at every game no matter how cold it was. For years, every dream I had was wrapped up in making sure he never felt the same hunger or fear I'd grown up with. After Janet died, the house grew quieter. Greg started spending more time out with friends, college applications scattered across the dining room table, the world pulling him further away with every acceptance letter. I paid off his loans one overtime shift at a time, sold my old Chevy to help him with his first apartment, and when he lost his job after the market crashed, I let him move back in. It was supposed to be temporary, but life has a way of taking temporary and stretching it out until you barely recognize it. The years bled together, each one a little harder than the last. I never complained, not really. That was just what fathers did. It was around then that Greg met Maria. She was kind to me at first, always making sure there was an extra plate at dinner, slipping me a piece of pie when no one was looking. But even kindness has a limit, and I could feel her patience thinning with every year that Greg couldn't seem to get ahead, with every bill that landed in the mailbox addressed to me. I tried to make myself useful, picking up groceries, fixing leaks, watching the twins when she had to work. For a while, it felt like a real family again, like maybe we could find our way back. But time and pressure crack everything eventually. I started to see the small signs. A sharp word here, a missed invitation there, family gatherings that somehow ended up scheduled while I was at my VA appointments. I tried to ignore it, tried to be grateful, but the gratitude started to feel like swallowing glass. One afternoon, while Greg was at work and Maria was taking a nap with Ellie, I went down to the basement to sort through some old boxes. It was cold and damp, the kind of place where memories cling to every corner. I found the shoebox where Janet kept every bill, every letter, every receipt, all stacked in careful order, rubber bands long since turned brittle with age. I opened the lid and felt a wave of something close to shame. All those years of saving, every penny counted, and now it had come to this. I pulled out a letter from Greg, written on wide-ruled notebook paper when he was 12, apologizing for breaking the neighbor's window, promising to pay it back out of his allowance. I remembered how proud I was that day. I tucked the letter into my pocket, unable to put it back with the others. Later, I sat at the kitchen table, the letter in front of me, hands shaking as I tried to reconcile the boy in the letter with the man upstairs. The next morning, I was up before sunrise. I made coffee in the old percolator, listening to the city waking up, car engines coughing to life, dogs barking in distant backyards, the rumble of trucks on the highway. I watched the steam curl up from my mug and realized that, for the first time in months, I didn't want to sit around waiting for the day to happen to me. I pulled out the notepad from the junk drawer and began to make a list. The bank balance, my social security statement, the names of old friends from the plant who might still pick up if I called. I wrote down the phone number for the senior center. Remembered seeing a flyer about free legal advice for people my age. I wasn't sure what I was looking for yet, but making the list felt like the first step out of the fog. Ellie wandered into the kitchen, hair a mess, dragging her favorite stuffed rabbit. She looked at me for a long moment before climbing onto my lap. She pressed her cheek to my shoulder and didn't say a word, just hugged me as if she understood more than any of the adults did. For the first time in weeks, I felt something other than emptiness. There was a tiny, fragile thread of hope, wound around the soft weight of her arm across my chest. Later that day, after Greg had come home and the house settled into its routine, I slipped out and walked to the corner store. The walk was slow, every step reminding me that I wasn't young anymore, that every ache and pain was a parting gift from a lifetime of hard work. I bought a lottery ticket, a habit Janet had teased me about, and a black coffee. As I sipped it outside on the bench, watching the world go by, I wondered what it would be like to just start over, somewhere far away, where no one knew my name or my story. By the time I got home, Greg was in the backyard, raking leaves into neat piles, his jaw clenched, the lines on his face deeper than I remembered. I watched him from the window, feeling something like sadness, something like pity, and maybe a flicker of understanding. Maybe he was scared, too. Maybe he didn't know how to ask for help without turning it into a demand. Or maybe that was just wishful thinking. I turned away, not wanting to see the man he'd become, not sure I'd ever find the boy I'd raised again. That evening, as we sat down to another silent dinner, I noticed Maria's eyes kept drifting to the envelope on the counter, the one that held my check for the month. Her face was drawn, tired, as if she'd aged 5 years overnight. She pushed her food around her plate, barely eating, and when Greg reached for the envelope, she looked away. Tommy started to ask about his birthday party, but Greg cut him off, reminding him that money was tight and there were more important things to worry about. The hurt on Tommy's face mirrored something deep inside me, something that had been there a long time, waiting for its moment. That night, I stood by the window, watching the headlights sweep across the wall as cars passed by on the street. I remembered a night, years ago, when Greg had called from college, panicked because he'd failed a test and was sure he'd lose his scholarship. I talked him through it, stayed on the phone for hours, promising him that no mistake was ever too big to fix. Now, as the city lights flickered in the distance, I wondered who would pick up the phone if I called for help. The silence in the house was thick, heavy, as if every breath I took was borrowed. But the next morning, I woke with resolve. I pulled on my boots, grabbed my coat, and walked to the senior center. The building was warm, filled with the quiet chatter of people my age, some playing cards, others swapping stories about grandkids or the weather. I asked at the front desk about legal aid, my voice shaky but determined. The woman behind the counter smiled and handed me a brochure. She asked if I needed coffee, and for the first time in weeks I accepted. As I left, the air felt lighter, as if the world had shifted an inch in my favor. I had a plan now, or the beginnings of one, and as I walked home, I felt the faint stirrings of hope, small but real. Something was changing, not just in the house, but in me. I knew it wouldn't be easy. I knew there would be nights when the grief would come back stronger than ever, when the memories would be sharper than any pain in my body. But I also knew I wasn't alone. Somewhere in the city, people like me were finding their voices, refusing to be invisible. That was enough for now to keep going. The day the money disappeared was gray from the start, a slate sky hanging over Cleveland that never quite let the light in. I woke early, as usual, the house quiet but tense, every board and hinge seeming to creak with secrets. Greg had already left for work. I could still smell the burnt toast from breakfast, and Maria's footsteps echoed from upstairs as she hustled the kids around, doing her best to keep the peace, to keep everything running like it hadn't all gone off the rails. I made my way to the dresser, reaching for the envelope with my name written in careful block letters. My hands shook, though I told myself it was just age. But when I opened the drawer, I felt my heart drop through the floor. Where I expected the thick wad of bills, there was just a limp 10 and a few crumpled singles, maybe $17 total, the sum that had become the running joke of my existence in this house. I tore through the drawers, tossing aside sweaters and socks, turning everything upside down, searching for something I already knew was gone. There were no signs of forced entry, no shattered glass, no marks on the door. Just the plain, sickening realization that the only people with access were the people I loved. That was the part that twisted the knife. The quiet betrayal that left no wound but cut just as deep. Downstairs, Maria was pouring cereal for the kids. Ellie looked up at me with wide eyes, already sensing that something was wrong. Tommy pretended not to notice, head down, shoveling frosted flakes like he could block out the world. Maria glanced at me, her lips tightening, maybe guessing what had happened but unwilling or unable to say a word. I stood in the kitchen, clutching the pitiful bills, and for a second, the house felt so small I couldn't breathe. I waited for Greg to come home, sat in the same chair where he'd delivered his ultimatum days before, my mind running over every conversation, every warning sign I'd ignored. When he walked in, there was no drama, just a flat, tired look in his eyes. I told him the money was missing, my voice low, as steady as I could make it. He didn't bother denying it. He just shrugged, like it was all a matter of course, like I was some kind of debtor who'd overstayed his welcome, and said the same thing he'd said 100 times. You live here, you pay. That's rent. He slid a crisp 20 across the table, as if that made it fair, as if that erased everything. I could barely look at him. There was a part of me that wanted to yell, to shake him, to demand the return of the boy who used to call me his hero. But the man before me was a stranger. I watched as Greg carried on with his evening, barely glancing in my direction, while Maria bustled around the kitchen, stacking plates, her eyes darting anywhere but at me. The twins retreated to their room, the sound of their laughter muffled now, quieter than it had ever been. I moved through the house like a ghost, gathering up what little I had. A suitcase with some clothes, the old photographs I refused to leave behind, Janet's wedding ring, tucked safely into a sock, her memory all I could hold on to. I waited until the house settled into silence before slipping into Greg's office, the door left slightly open in his haste. I found the briefcase where he kept the bills, the insurance papers, the contracts he never read. Beneath a folder of receipts, I saw it. A manila envelope, thick with the money he'd stolen from me. I counted it twice, the bills rough against my skin, and stuffed it deep in my jacket pocket. It didn't feel like victory. It felt like survival, like reclaiming a piece of myself he'd tried to erase. When Maria saw me at the door, suitcase in hand, she looked torn, worried, guilty, but not surprised. She asked me not to go, her voice small, as if she was afraid of what Greg would do without me as a buffer. But I couldn't stay. There comes a point when you have to stop bleeding for people who can't see your wounds. I told her as much, and the words left my mouth colder than I intended. She said nothing more, just watched as I stepped into the chill of the evening, the city lights flickering in the dusk. I walked for blocks, the weight of the suitcase dragging at my shoulder, every step pulling me further from the life I'd built, the life I'd lost. I found a cheap motel on a side street not far from the steel plant where I'd worked half my life. The desk clerk didn't ask questions. I paid in cash, counting the bills twice before handing them over, the money already burning a hole in my conscience. The room smelled of bleach and old cigarettes, the kind of place where no one cared about your story. I sat on the edge of the bed, letting the silence close in. I pulled out Janet's ring, turning it over and over in my hands, letting the memories flood through me. The world outside was full of noise, cars, sirens, voices. But in that room, there was only the quiet thud of my heart, and the growing certainty that I couldn't go back. Not now, not ever. That night, I slept fitfully, dreaming of the old days. Cookouts in the backyard, Janet's laughter, Greg chasing fireflies with the twins. But every time I reached out, the scene faded, replaced by the cold glare of the kitchen, the weight of his disappointment, the echo of his voice telling me I owed him for the roof over my head. I woke up shivering, the sun just starting to bleed through the thin curtains. For a moment, I wondered if I could just disappear, start over in some other city, somewhere no one knew my name. But then I remembered the list I'd made, the plan I'd started to build in the back of my mind. I wasn't going to vanish. I was going to fight. I spent the morning searching for help, starting at the senior center, asking for legal aid, for any advice they could offer someone in my position. The woman at the desk, her name was Francine, looked at me with the kind of kindness that almost broke me. She handed me a pamphlet, explained the steps I'd need to take, who to call, how to gather evidence. There were people, she said, who specialized in this kind of thing. People who understood that what had happened to me wasn't just a family squabble. It was abuse. The word hit hard, but I clung to it. Abuse. That was what it was. Not just hurt feelings, not just a bad argument, but something systematic, calculated, wrong. Armed with the advice and a fistful of pamphlets, I called the legal hotline, my voice shaking as I explained what had happened. The woman on the other end listened, her questions direct but never unkind. She asked about the house, about my income, about the bills, about the money that had gone missing. She told me to gather every document I could, deeds, bank statements, receipts, anything that proved the house was mine, that the money was mine, that I wasn't just some boarder in my own life. For the first time in weeks, I felt the faintest hint of control. I still had agency. I still had a say. In the days that followed, I went back to the house while Greg was at work. Maria let me in, never meeting my eyes, never asking questions. I dug through old boxes in the basement, found the original deed with my name on it, the mortgage statements, every canceled check. I snapped photos of the documents, stored them on a cheap flip phone I bought at the drugstore, determined to leave a trail even if Greg tried to shut me out completely. I gathered statements from the neighbors, Mrs. Donovan, who'd seen me mowing the lawn all those years, Mr. Holtz, who remembered the day I moved in, the barbecue in the driveway. Their words, their memories, gave me the strength to keep going, to keep piecing together the life Greg had tried to rewrite. Each day was a battle. The loneliness, the shame, the sense of betrayal, these things didn't fade. But with every document I found, every small victory, I felt a little more like myself, like the man Janet would have wanted me to be. The pain was still there, raw and aching, but I refused to let it be the only thing I felt. I started making plans, real plans, not just dreams. I talked to the lawyer Francine had recommended, a sharp woman named Sandra who didn't flinch when I told her the truth. She outlined the steps we'd take, the letters we'd send, the case we'd build. She told me it wouldn't be easy, that families could be the most vicious enemies of all, but that I wasn't alone anymore. One evening, as I walked back to the motel, the city alive with the hum of life, I realized that something had shifted inside me. The fear was still there, but it was tempered by something new, resolve. I wasn't the man Greg could bully, or the father who'd always cave to keep the peace. I was someone who'd survived more than most, who'd built something out of nothing, who'd carried a family on his back for decades. I would not be erased. The fight was just beginning, and for the first time in a long time, I looked forward to tomorrow. Not because I expected it to be easy, but because I knew I was strong enough to meet it head-on. Sandra told me the first step was to set the trap, but the word itself made me uneasy. I wasn't used to thinking of my own child as an enemy, wasn't used to plotting moves the way men did in card games at the VFW hall. Still, I had learned the hard way that survival meant adaptation, and I wasn't about to let Greg's betrayal become the final word in my story. Every night at the motel, I sat at the rickety desk, sorting through stacks of paperwork. Old tax returns, Janet's careful records, the deed with my name still shining in blue ink. The more I pieced together, the more I saw the strength in those forgotten details. Janet always said the truth is in the small things, and she was right. Sandra showed me how to document everything, how to build a timeline, how to anticipate every trick Greg's lawyer might try. Sometimes, after she'd gone home, I'd reread her notes, the legal jargon making my head spin, but the underlying meaning was always clear. This was a fight for more than just a house or a check. This was about respect, dignity, the legacy of a life spent giving instead of taking. One afternoon, after a particularly long meeting with Sandra, I took the bus to a coffee shop near my old neighborhood, the kind of place Janet and I used to stop after doctor's appointments. The woman behind the counter smiled at me like she remembered, but I knew it was just good manners. As I sipped my coffee, I wrote letters, to old coworkers, to neighbors, even to the pastor at the church I hadn't attended in years. I asked for their memories, their statements, anything that could show I'd always been the one to pay, to fix, to hold everything together. To my surprise, most answered within days. Mrs. Donovan wrote in her careful cursive, reminding me of the time I'd repaired her fence after a storm. Mr. Holtz sent a photo from the block party I'd hosted, Janet beaming at my side, the house gleaming in the background. Even the pastor wrote, saying he'd testify to my character, my commitment, my sacrifices. The words brought a sharp ache to my chest, grief mixed with gratitude, a sense that I wasn't as alone as I'd feared. Greg, meanwhile, seemed to sense a shift in the air, even if he didn't know the details. Maria called once, her voice quiet, asking if I'd come home, if I could forgive Greg for losing his temper, for letting the pressure get to him. But she didn't offer an apology for what had happened, didn't promise things would be different. I told her I'd think about it, but the truth was, I'd already made up my mind. I couldn't go back. Not to the house, not to the old patterns that had left me empty. I needed to see this through. The first official step was Sandra's letter, a crisp document printed on her law firm's letterhead, addressed to Greg, outlining every offense, every theft, every right I still held. I watched her slip it into the envelope, her face unreadable, her voice gentle but firm as she explained what would happen next. The letter wasn't just a warning. It was a declaration. I was coming for what was mine. Greg's response came quickly, a flurry of angry voicemails, threats to call his own lawyer, accusations of betrayal. For a moment, the guilt flared up in me. Had I failed him as a father, as a guide? Was this what Janet would have wanted? But I shoved the doubts aside. I had tried everything I could, given more than anyone could ask, and now it was time to demand some measure of respect in return. Sandra's strategy was methodical, her instructions precise. We gathered bank statements, pulled property records, even tracked down the receipts from Greg's so-called improvements to the house, none of which were paid for by him. She encouraged me to keep a journal, to record every interaction, every threat, every payment or lack thereof. It felt odd at first, like spying on my own life, but I understood the necessity. This was war, even if I hadn't wanted it. Maria reached out more often as the weeks passed, sometimes to check on me, sometimes to plead for peace. The twins drew pictures for me, clumsy crayon sketches of our old cookouts, of Janet's flower garden, of the swing set I'd built for them the summer before last. I kept the drawings in my wallet, a reminder of what I was fighting for. I wondered if they'd ever truly understand why I had to leave, why love sometimes means refusing to let yourself be trampled. The hardest part was knowing that every step forward in court made the rift between me and Greg wider, maybe unbridgeable. But as Sandra kept reminding me, it was Greg who had chosen this path. I was just refusing to stay lost in the dark. The first court filing brought it all into focus. Sandra handed me a stack of papers, each one a milestone on the road back to dignity. The official complaint, the evidence list, the sworn statements from neighbors and friends. It was overwhelming. Pages and pages of my life, turned into legalese, each one another layer of armor between me and the shame that had haunted me for months. The day we filed, Sandra took me to lunch, a small act of kindness that made me feel seen, even as the world kept spinning outside. We talked about Janet, about her own father, about the ways families could wound each other deeper than any stranger ever could. When she drove me back to the motel, she pressed my hand and said, "You're not alone in this. Remember that." The days that followed were a blur of anxiety and anticipation. Greg stopped calling. Maria texted updates about the twins, but her messages were short, guarded. I spent more time at the senior center, playing chess with a man named Leo who'd fought his own battle with family over a pension check. We traded stories, laughed at the absurdity of growing old in a world that saw us as expendable. Leo said something that stuck with me. "You don't really know who you are until you have to fight for yourself." I thought of Janet, of the nights we'd spent talking about the future, about the kind of old age we'd imagined. It wasn't this, but it was something, at least, a chance to stand tall, if only for myself. The notice of the court date arrived in a plain envelope, the kind that never brought good news. My hands trembled as I opened it, reading and rereading the date, the courtroom, the judge's name. Felt real now, irreversible. I called Sandra, who talked me through what to expect, what to wear, what to say. She promised to be there every step of the way. I thanked her, my voice thick with emotion I couldn't quite name. That night, I sat by the motel window, looking out at the city lights, wondering if Greg was doing the same. I wondered if he regretted any of it, if he missed the sound of my voice, the smell of Janet's pot roast, the warmth of a home that used to be ours. In the quiet hours before the hearing, I found myself returning to the old habit of prayer, not for victory, but for clarity, for the strength to speak my truth and accept whatever came next. I wasn't just fighting for a house or a check. I was fighting for the right to exist, to matter, to be seen as more than an obligation. I thought of Ellie and Tommy, of the future I still wanted for them. One where kindness wasn't mistaken for weakness, where love didn't mean surrendering your self-worth. As I drifted off to sleep, the city humming in the distance, I promised myself that no matter the outcome, I would not shrink, would not disappear. I would meet Greg in that courtroom, look him in the eye and remind myself that I was still here, still standing, still worthy of respect. The courtroom was nothing like I'd imagined. I'd pictured something grand and imposing, maybe even intimidating. A place where men in suits traded words like weapons. But it was smaller, quieter, humming with a kind of low, buzzing tension, everyone pretending not to stare at one another. I could feel my hands sweating even before I'd taken my seat. Sandra was at my side, her presence solid and reassuring, her hands steady as she laid out our documents, our statements, our little fortress of paper built from 40 years of memories and mistakes. Greg sat on the other side of the aisle, slouched in his suit, hair neat, eyes rimmed red with exhaustion and pride. I caught a glimpse of Maria and the twins in the back row, the kids' faces tight and nervous, Maria wringing her hands in her lap like she was trying to keep herself from coming apart. It struck me all at once that no one wins in rooms like this, that every verdict leaves scars. The judge entered and the hush that fell over the room was absolute. He was older than I'd expected, with a hard jaw and gray hair cut short, the kind of face that looked like it could spot a lie from 100 yards. He called the case. My name and Greg's echoing in the space, impossibly loud and final. My stomach churned. Sandra's hand on my arm was the only thing steady about me, a silent reminder that I wasn't alone. She opened by laying out the facts. The deed in my name, the pension checks diverted, the years of work and sacrifice that built the house, paid every bill. She spoke in calm, measured tones, each word chosen to show not only the money lost, but the dignity stolen along with it. As she talked, I felt the room shift. People leaned forward, attention fixed. My story was no longer just mine. It belonged to the silent watchers in the gallery, to every parent who'd ever worried about growing old and forgotten, every child who'd crossed a line they could never uncross. Greg's lawyer rose, a young man named Turner, eyes darting from his notes to the judge, then to Greg, then back again. His arguments sounded hollow even to my ears. He talked about family understandings, about temporary arrangements, about the sacrifices Greg claimed to have made. But with every claim, Sandra countered, pointing to the paperwork, to the neighbors' affidavits, to the bank statements that told a very different story. The judge listened, silent, his eyes rarely leaving Greg's face. When it was my turn to speak, my hands shook, but my voice did not. I talked about Janet, about the house we'd built room by room, about teaching Greg to ride his bike and patching up his scrapes, about watching the twins play in the same yard where he'd once chased fireflies. I told the court about the night I realized the money was gone, about the humiliation, about standing in my own kitchen and feeling like a stranger in the only home I'd ever known. I said it not with anger, but with a sadness that filled the room, leaving no air for argument. Greg looked down at the table, his face gray. When he took the stand, his answers were short, clipped, his voice brittle with resentment. He tried to explain, to blame the economy, the cost of living, the pressures of raising a family. The judge pressed him gently but firmly, asking for proof, for records, for receipts that never appeared. With each question, Greg shrank further into himself, his bravado crumbling. Maria watched, tears streaming silently down her face, Ellie and Tommy clinging to her hands, their little bodies tense and still. I saw flashes of the boy I once knew, The son who'd been so quick to smile, to run into my arms after a long shift, who'd promised, so many years ago, to take care of me when I got old. The testimony stretched on, hours blurring together, the air growing heavy and stale. There was a break for lunch, but I barely tasted the food Sandra brought me. I wandered the halls, remembering old stories I used to tell Greg as a child. Stories of men who stood up for what was right even when it cost them everything. When we returned, Sandra called the neighbors. Mrs. Donovan with her careful recollection of holidays. Mr. Holtz with his block party photos. Even the pastor, who spoke about Janet's kindness and my steadfastness in the face of loss. Their words felt like balm, healing parts of me I hadn't known were still wounded. The judge listened, nodded, made notes. I watched his pen move, each stroke carving a new future out of the tangled mess we'd made. Turner tried again, desperate now to spin a story of misunderstanding. He argued that families fight, that mistakes are made, that all Greg wanted was a chance to make things right. But the judge was unmoved. He asked Greg if he'd ever offered to pay rent, to split the bills, to return even a fraction of what he'd taken. Greg's silence was answer enough. Maria wept openly now, the twins burying their faces in her arms. I felt the weight of every sacrifice I'd ever made, every late night and early morning, every dollar pinched and plan deferred. I wondered if it was all worth it, if this victory would taste like ash in my mouth. Finally, the judge spoke. His words were simple, unadorned. He found for me on every count: eviction, compensation, damages. He ordered Greg to vacate the house within 30 days, to pay back the money taken, to apologize in writing. The words landed like thunder, final and irreversible. Greg slumped, the fight draining out of him, tears streaking down his face. He looked at me, and for a moment, there was nothing between us but shared sorrow. I wanted to reach out, to tell him it didn't have to be this way, but the moment passed. Maria led him from the room, the kids trailing behind, their eyes wide and uncertain. Sandra hugged me, her voice quiet in my ear. I nodded, numb, my mind struggling to catch up. I gathered my papers, my memories, my battered pride, and walked out into the afternoon sun. The world looked the same. Cars rushing by, strangers laughing, the city pulsing with life. But I was different. I was free, but I was changed. I knew the victory had come at a price, that the wounds would take time to heal, if they ever did. Still, as I made my way back to the motel, I felt lighter than I had in months, maybe years. I thought of Janet, of her laugh, of her faith in me, and hoped I'd made her proud. That night, as I lay in the narrow bed, the judge's words echoing in my mind, I wondered what came next. I thought of the house, my house, waiting for me, empty but full of memories, ready to be filled again. I thought of Greg, of Maria, of the twins, and prayed they'd find their way back to each other, that the rift between us wouldn't last forever. But I also knew some things can't be undone, that some losses are permanent. Still, I closed my eyes with a kind of peace, knowing I'd done what I had to do, that I'd fought for myself, for my future, for the family I'd built from nothing. In the darkness, I made myself a promise. I would not let this be the end of my story. I would rebuild, not just the house, but the life I'd almost lost. I would open the doors, let in the light, invite old friends and new memories. And maybe, someday Greg would knock and I would answer not as a victim, but as a father, a survivor, a man who'd learned, at last, how to stand up for himself. The first morning back in my house, I woke before the sun. It was as if the walls themselves wanted to remind me this was home. My home. Every floorboard and doorknob holding echoes of all I had endured. I wandered through the rooms, my footsteps soft on floors I'd refinished decades earlier, taking in the smell of old wood and lemon polish, the faded wallpaper in the hallway Janet had chosen after we finally paid off the mortgage. The light was thin and pale, slipping around corners and settling on photos framed above the mantel. Greg at 6, holding a fishing rod. Janet's smile beaming from beneath a sun hat. The twins, caught mid-laughter in the backyard during some forgotten summer. Everything felt familiar but also altered. It was as if, while I was gone, the house had aged and grieved with me, waiting in its own silent way for a chance to breathe again. I made coffee in the old percolator, the same battered pot Janet swore made better brew than any newfangled machine. The kitchen, stripped of Maria's fancy gadgets, felt both emptier and more honest. I watched the sunlight crawl across the table, glinting off the cup in my hand, and let myself feel the victory. Not the kind you cheer for, but the quiet kind. The kind that seeps in slow and steady and asks you to measure everything you've lost against all you've regained. There were days in that motel room when I didn't know if I'd ever sit here again, if I'd ever taste coffee in my own kitchen, if anything I did would matter. Now, with the city waking up outside, I realized how much of life happens in the small moments, the simple acts, the routines that hold us steady when everything else is falling apart. There was work to do, of course. The house needed repairs, a gutter sagging, a broken step out back, a fence that leaned a little more each year. I spent my afternoons patching and painting, the tasks as familiar as breathing. I let myself enjoy the labor, each ache and sore muscle proof that I was still capable, still useful. Sometimes, as I worked, neighbors would call over the fence, offering a kind word or a plate of cookies, stories of their own families, their own struggles. It struck me that everyone on this street was holding on to something. Memories, regrets, a sense of belonging that no court could take away. The loneliness was still there, but it wasn't sharp anymore. It was a gentle ache, softened by the rhythm of days, the promise of new beginnings. A few weeks passed before I heard from Greg. At first, there were just short, formal texts about paperwork and deadlines, the kind of messages you send when you don't know what else to say. Then, late one evening, the phone rang. I almost didn't answer, but something in me still hoped for more than bitterness between us. Greg's voice was small, strained, nothing like the man who had sat across from me in court. He apologized, haltingly, for everything. He said he didn't expect forgiveness, that he'd lost sight of what mattered, that he was sorry for letting fear and pride turn him into someone neither of us recognized. I listened, my chest tight, my mind a tangle of anger, relief, and something close to grief. I told him he didn't have to say it all at once, that we both had healing to do, that some wounds would take longer than others. He asked if we could meet just for coffee somewhere neutral. I agreed, and we settled on a diner downtown, one Janet and I used to visit after Sunday services. Meeting Greg again outside the courtroom felt like walking a tightrope over a canyon of unspoken words. He looked older, tired, but there was something softer about him now, as if the fight had burned away his armor. We talked about the kids, how Ellie was learning to play the piano, how Tommy had joined the soccer team, how they missed me. We talked about Maria, about the stress of finding a new apartment, about starting over with less than they'd planned. I told him about the repairs, about the neighbors, about the quiet that sometimes settled in the house at night. There were pauses, long and heavy, when neither of us knew what to say. But there was also laughter, small and tentative, the kind that bubbles up in spite of everything. After that, things didn't return to how they'd been, but they changed. Greg sent photos of the twins at their games, sometimes asking if I wanted to join. Maria reached out too, her messages softer, more honest, sometimes just asking how I was, sometimes sharing a recipe for a dish she knew I liked. I visited the senior center more often, volunteering to help others navigate the same legal maze I'd just survived. I led workshops, sharing my story not out of pride, but out of a belief that no one should feel as alone or helpless as I once did. It felt good to help, to listen, to watch others reclaim their sense of self. I found myself laughing more, not because everything was fixed, but because I finally believed it could get better. The seasons turned, spring melting into summer, the garden blooming with Janet's roses, their scent drifting through open windows. I took up photography, a hobby Janet had always meant to try. I wandered the city with an old camera, capturing sunrises over Lake Erie, kids skipping rope in the street, couples holding hands on park benches. Through the lens, I saw Cleveland anew. A city battered but still beautiful, filled with stories as complicated and hopeful as mine. Sometimes, I'd print a photo and tape it to the fridge, reminders that life, even when broken, could be stitched back together one image, one day at a time. One evening, as I was cleaning up after dinner, there was a knock at the door. It was Greg, alone, his hands shoved deep in his pockets. He stood on the porch, shifting from foot to foot, the way he used to when he was a boy caught in some mischief. He said he'd been thinking about everything, about how close he'd come to losing not just the house, but his father, his children's grandfather, the family stories that made up the roots of who they were. He asked if he could come in just for a little while. I let him. We sat in the living room, surrounded by decades of memories, and talked late into the night. About Janet, about mistakes, about forgiveness that doesn't come easy, but is no less real for that. I realized then that justice and mercy are not opposites, but two sides of the same coin. The law had given me back my house, my money, my dignity, but it was forgiveness, slow and stumbling, that started to rebuild what had been lost between us. I didn't forget and I didn't excuse, but I let the past be past, making room for whatever came next. When Greg left that night, he hugged me, the first time in years, and for a moment it felt like the world had tilted back into place, just a little. As summer faded, I traveled down to Florida to see old friends from the plant, men who'd retired before me, who greeted me with bear hugs and cold beers, who listened without judgment as I told them what had happened. They told their own stories, some with endings happy, some not, but all of them stitched together by the stubborn hope that keeps men like us moving forward. I found comfort in their company, in the shared history, in the reminder that I was never truly alone. Back in Cleveland, I kept volunteering, kept taking photos, kept showing up for the Twins games. Sometimes Maria would join me, sometimes Greg, sometimes just the kids. Each time felt like a step forward, small and uncertain, but forward all the same. The house was full again, sometimes with laughter, sometimes with tears, sometimes just with the quiet presence of people trying their best. On the anniversary of Janet's passing, we all gathered in the backyard, planting new roses in her honor, telling stories she would have loved, holding tight to the memory of the woman who had taught us that love, above all, means never giving up on each other. The journey back from betrayal wasn't a straight line. There were setbacks, angry words, moments when I wondered if it would ever truly heal. But there was also progress, forgiveness, and the slow, persistent rebuilding of trust. I learned to live with the scars, not as marks of defeat, but as reminders of resilience, of a life fiercely reclaimed. I learned to measure happiness not by what I'd lost, but by what I'd found. Self-respect, new friends, and a deeper connection to the family that remained. If you had told me a year ago that I'd be here, at my own table, surrounded by photos and laughter and the ghosts of old wounds finally laid to rest, I wouldn't have believed you. But life, for all its cruelty and beauty, keeps moving, carrying us forward whether we're ready or not. As I sit here now, coffee in hand, sunlight pouring through the windows, I feel the weight of gratitude, of forgiveness, of a second chance hard one. I think of Janet, of Greg, of Ellie and Tommy, of the house that held us through it all, and I know this isn't the end. It's just another beginning.